Hi everyone, this part 2 of the video so you can keep watching. But don't forget to watch part 1 for more benefit. The 12th amateur writing mistake. This one is a little more meta in terms of like whole story. And that is when they have something that is either way too short or way too long for the word count conventions of whatever they are writing. This includes a person who writes 13,000 words and calls that a novel that is, at best, a short story, maybe on its way to being a novella. It's when you write 250,000 words of your fantasy novel, and the average word count of a debut fantasy novel is at most 120,000 words. It is a proper novel, but it's a sci-fi novel, and it's only 50,000 words. That's a red flag. There's not enough world building or complex of a plot. So this is an amateur mistake of not having a firm enough understanding of the art form, and very often indicates that a person doesn't actually read the kinds of things that they're writing, or at the least hasn't done any research into conventions and those kind of to low or to high word counts or calling something a novel. When it's a short story, it indicates that there are myriad other issues because there's that kind of fundamental misunderstanding. So the 13th amateur writing mistake. This one kind of harkens back to that pacing mistake. And that is all a plot. No B-plot. Definitely see this a ton in first drafts of first novels or early novel drafts by writers. And that's when they definitely have a plot in mind. And a plot is the easiest plot to come up with. It is your main plot, and you come up with it, and you outline it, and bam, bam, bam. You move through that story, and you tell the story, but very often it's a little too short. Or, if it's not too short, it has a ton of filler in it. But if it's all a plot with no B-plot whatsoever, or other plots, no subplots, the book isn't going to be complex enough or complicated enough, and a plot in and of itself is not usually a complete story. Basically a book that is all a plot. No B-plot will probably have serious pacing problems, and is just generally going to feel not like a particularly complex or layered story. But before we continue the video, don't forget to subscribe to help us, and thank you. They don't feel like layered, complex, fleshed out people who actually live in the worlds that you've created, who occupy the worlds of your story. You have them walking through big plots and having big emotions, but it's not tethered to anything, particularly in the beginning. And when you don't have a firm sense of where your character starts and what your world really is, because you're essentially world building through character with social world building, it's basically your book, your plot. The reading experience is going to feel very it's like a facsimile of a story. It's a thing that exists, but it's so kind of simple and thin, like, watered down milk that there's no fat to it, there's no meat to it. And it's like, yeah, it's a story, but I didn't feel connected to it in any deep or specific kind of way. And it's usually because there is a total lack of social world building. It is essentially the problem where your characters feel very surface, very flat. Yes, they are technically characters who live and eat and breathe and exist in the space, but you could swap them out for any other living, breathing creature or human being, and the plot would be exactly the same because you've given no texture to the world via texturizing your character by giving them specific wants and needs and backgrounds and thoughts and feelings and hobbies and all sorts of stuff. By developing the social world, you're not just developing your main character, but all of your characters in your entire world, because it becomes a more complex ecosystem, because that's what life is. It's a bunch of complex, interlocking parts. And when you skimp on those details, the whole thing just falls flat. The 15th amateur writing mistake. It's like the old dystopia joke. But I mean, we see it a ton in speculative fiction especially, and that is excessive capitalization of things, giving all sorts of things a proper noun as a way to sound fancy and speculative. It's basically a writing cheat, particularly in science fiction and fantasy writing. It's not like you can never do it. It's a convention of genre for a reason, but I definitely consider it an amateur writing mistake because it's always the amateurs who you see going overboard with it. So be wary of world building in your speculative fiction where it's like, I know I'll just give it a kind of imposing, proper noun. That'll work, Yeah, a little is okay. A lot is a lot. The 16th worst amateur writing mistake. I hate this one's very 101, or at least it bugs me in particular. And you're at the biggest risk of doing it in third person. And that is head hopping. So head hopping is when in a scene that is from the point of view of a particular character, you suddenly jump into the head of another character and you have thoughts and feelings and observations that your POV narrator should not know. Now, some styles of third-person hip-hop as a matter of course, and that is great for them. But where this is a problem is when they are not writing that type of fiction. I most often see amateur head hopping when they are writing limited POV. They're in first person, they're in third person, limited. It is from the point of view of, say, Isaiah. It's a teen princess, and the teen princess is at court, and all of a sudden I'm in the prince's head. And what is happening? If you want to write multi-POV, that is fine. But going back and forth between multi-POV in a single scene when you are doing close perspective, it's messy, it's confusing for the reading. It pulls them out of the story and the perspective they were in. If you want to do it within a chapter, you just need a little section break or do your different POVs in different chapters. You always want to keep track of what is the POV of this scene through whose eyes. From what lens am I telling the story? And you want to stick to that number 17, which I actually think is the worst amateur writing mistake. Personally, it is the biggest thing that I think stands in the way of writers from leveling up and being better storytellers. I could shout about it forever. Telling. Now I am not a show. Don't tell proselytizer because I am someone who tends towards telling and has struggled over the many years with telling. But that's why I am super confident and comfortable telling you that excessive telling is a massive amateur mistake. You are directly getting in the way of your story, your own writing, and it getting across to readers in an effective way. The thing with telling, it's you're telling the story instead of letting a reader experience the story. Show don't tell is honestly very reductive. Telling is, by its very nature, passive, in a way. There's distance in telling now. Often the distance in narrative telling is actually a great storytelling technique when used specifically in moderation. So it's a matter of actually understanding what a narrative telling technique is and when to use it where telling becomes a problem in amateur writing. Telling is info-dumping. Telling is going overboard with telling verbs and adverbs in your dialogue scenes. Telling is filtering, which I did not give its own thing on this list, but it's part of telling, so it counts. Filtering is when you use verbs like feel, see, hear, know, decide, assume, and it basically literally creates a filter on an action. I feel angry instead of describing anger. It's blow-by-blow narration, walking people through a mundane scene, literally describing every single thing a character does and sees. It's plotting, storytelling, and you basically get in the way of active and descriptive and interesting storytelling when all you do is tell. I would seriously wager that a majority of writers who struggle to get to that next level, who struggle to get an agent, who have CPS, who ghost them, and so on and so on. If they're not doing the 101 amateur mistakes, they have a problem with telling and may not realize it, because telling is complex and there's a ton of amateur mistakes that come under telling. It's basically all the things you do in your writing that put distance between the reader and the story. And again, I'm allowed to be really salty about this because I come from a tradition of telling and I've had to work on it myself. You do not have to eliminate telling altogether. It can be a very effective writing style, but it's developing your skills so that you don't make some of these specific amateur mistakes, so that your writing's a little more vivid, a little more active. You're varying your sentence structures. You're creating really sensory scenes so that, yeah, you can have some lines of tallying, and it really doesn't matter because you just need to efficiently move them from one place to the other, and it's totally fine. But when you're doing that efficient telling, writing all the time, it stops being efficient when it's all that you have. The 18th amateur writing mistake. This one bugs me in particular, and that is the lack of internal logic for your characters and your character actions, particularly antagonists. That's where it's like pet peeve for me with antagonists. But it's bad with any character, particularly main characters. When I was talking about melodrama, part of melodrama, often not working when it's like a blow-up scene of melodrama is if it breaks the internal character logic or the internal logic of a character. It's not logical for them to lose their ish with someone and start shouting. That is part of the problem. There should always be internal story logic, and again, you should do that social world building because it's part of what gives you structure and logic to your character, to your world. How is the character feeling in this moment and why? The why shouldn't be because I need them to feel sad because it's a sad plot point. The why should be, well, they feel sad because X. Y, Z thing from their past. They had a relationship here. They really wanted this. They have this personality trait or they had this traumatic experience. There should be a rhyme and reason to every single beat of your character. And look, you can have a character need to do something for plot reasons, but then you have to do the work going backwards to create story logic, to create character logic to fit your plot. You never want your reader to go, why? Like, I don't understand why they did that. That's weird. That makes no sense. You don't want to get into a situation where the character feels out of character. They feel out of character because what is their character? Did you ground their character well enough? If you did ground a character well enough, but then they do something wackadoodle, you've broken your character and story logic, but most often I find that the characters aren't grounded, and that's why there isn't story logic. But also for antagonists, I hate it when someone just all of a sudden is like a total psycho, because the story needs them to be. You definitely want to have impeccable logic for your antagonists. And there's actually a whole plot thing for writing thrillers where you should come up with kind of the story behind the story. Beat by beat of everything your antagonist said and did and felt and was thinking and essentially fully developed that character. So there's always an inherent logic to how they behave, including when they're not being a huge villain. So yeah, lack of internal logic is a big one, because then it just feels like a series of scenes and things that happen to a character in a story that technically has a plot, but none of it is cohesive. It doesn't really come together. The 19th worst amateur writing mistake is when you have pointlessly purple prose. This is where you have a writer who thinks that to be a writer means to use big, fancy words and big fancy constructions. They're probably not using repetitive sentence structure or one-sent verbs. They're using exclusively fancy literary prose. But what can end up happening is when a writer essentially writes pretentiously because they think it makes them sound smart or fancy. The sentences and words and the way that things come together can ultimately feel kind of empty or meaningless. There's a difference between a writer who has a really great command of the English language and a very specific, yes, literary style, and a writer who's stretching themselves and kind of overcompensating or writing that way because they're imitating other writers. And it's just definitely an amateur mistake of essentially imitating without substance. So I caution writers, honestly, nothing wrong with a super basic, simple sentence that you can edit later to make it more complex, but kind of writing just ridiculous purple prose. Especially overworked metaphors that don't technically mean anything, and descriptions that are a little bit muddled. That's not good writing. The 20th worst amateur writing mistake. This one's pretty straightforward, and that is overly formal writing. Your characters don't speak in contractions ever. If you're writing any kind of modern fiction that isn't historical, you're allowed to use contractions. It's okay, it doesn't make you sound basic. There was this kind of old school convention in writing that good educated writers did not use contractions. I mean, English teachers used to literally get mad about it. Same thing with starting a sentence with a conjunction, which is now completely acceptable. So this is the thing. If you're overly formal in your writing style, where it's are we in English class in the 1950s? The writing is going to feel belabored and a bit out of time. It's not how people actually speak or think. So yeah, do not be afraid of informal language thoughtfully and artfully sprinkled through a manuscript. If you're too formal, the writing basically comes across stiff. Number 21 is my old friend character soup. Huge amateur writing mistake. And that is just cramming your story full of dozens and dozens and dozens of characters. You know that thing I mentioned, the Bob, where you basically use characters, especially early on, but they solely exist for exposition. A lot of those characters can get cut and will contribute to character soup. Often we'll do character soup because we're striving for realism. But there's this line between realism, and it's this kind of elevated world of fiction where it's totally okay for a person to only have two friends, not 5 or 6 or 7, because realistically, you can only keep track of so many characters. Your character doesn't have to name and describe every single character that they interact with in a story. Not every single person is going to be important. You can say offhand that they passed a person and they said hello, although that really doesn't contribute to story. And that's the thing with character soup. You have to brutally evaluate what are the actual character functions, because there's only so many characters that readers can keep track of, that readers can care about. There's only so many characters you can give substantive character arcs to. And so too many characters will feel like dead weight. They overcomplicate a story, and it's definitely an amateur mistake. And it's a matter of cutting some of those filler characters when you were doing your revisions. Number 22 is all about character, and it is a combination of either characters with no flaws, characters that nothing really bad happens to, or characters who don't have agency in their story. It's the amateur mistake of character problems, particularly your main characters. What often will fall under this as well is kind of the self-insert thing, which I hesitate to call an amateur writing mistake because I think everyone gets to have one self-insert character. It's a thing that we do, especially in earlier work, and writing a self-insert can actually be very instructive to writing characters generally and getting better at writing. But what happens often with a self-insert is we're often not as quite aware of our own flaws, so those characters are less likely to be flawed. But also we're less likely to do terrible things to self-insert characters. But even when they're not self-insert, we love our characters' authors. We love our characters like we build them, and they're our babies, and we want them to get what they want. And so very often, we won't put enough obstacles in their way or think bad things will happen to the character. But it's not the worst thing that could happen to our character, and often it's pushing yourself in just the right spot in your manuscript, usually where you're encountering problems with pacing or with character arcs and growth. You're getting feedback from people that the story loses steam or they don't understand a character choice. And sometimes the thing that you have to do is get really messy with your characters, and don't be afraid to dirty them up. But also look at agency. It's a huge amateur pitfall. Not even 101. You can struggle with this. You know, for years and years and multiple manuscripts to have your character be active in the plot, to not just have bad things happen to them. Now, bad things can happen to them, and then they can have agency and reacting to them. But you still want to take care that some of the bad things that happens to them, that enough of the things that happen, enough of the plot mechanics that happen because your character makes choices. You have to allow them to make the wrong choices. It's agency if they make the wrong choice, and then of course, they're going to have to respond to it and fix things. And that's what makes main characters feel more active and interesting. But yeah, it's definitely an amateur mistake that I see where essentially writers are afraid to dirty up their characters, to make them really interesting and give them something to do. So that is a ton of amateur writing mistakes. The ones that I see crop up over and over again that I think if writers really think about these things, if you go, oh no, I do that, just work on that thing. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make more kind of listicle style videos like this. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and happy writing. See you all in the next video.